Welcome back to part 2 of the Politics and Media programme. More people than ever before are opposed to the coalition government's austerity programme, according to the government's own opinion poll, the British Social Attitude Survey. Instead, support is strengthening for greater public spending, even if it means more taxation. The report comes as the TUC plans for a mass demonstration against the cuts to public services on the 20th of October. The report also revealed that more people think that the government should spend less on benefits, particularly for the unemployed, and that people are increasingly worried about immigration. To examine the political prospects, I have with me Jonathan Issenby, who's Political Director of the Taxpayers Alliance, and Tim Nichols, Media and Parliamentary Officer for the Child Poverty Action Group. Welcome to you both. Tim, what's your reaction to this series of responses? This is the government's own survey. It's a very extensive, probably the most extensive survey of public opinion in the country. So what do you make of it?
Well, we are not seeing any positive effects from the austerity agenda of the government. We are back in recession, so clearly Plan A isn't working, and I think it's not surprising, therefore, that the public would like to see a change of course from the government. It is concerning to see the attitudes that are there in relation to benefits, but I think one important thing to remember is that these are really based on people's perceptions about benefit claimants, and there's a great deal of research to show that what people believe about benefit claimants is not necessarily true. For example, the public tend to estimate that people get twice as much in unemployment benefit than they actually really do get. So therefore, we shouldn't be so surprised if people say they think that people are getting too much in unemployment benefits if people actually think they get twice as much as they really do get.
Jonathan, what do you make of it? I mean, the government's only 20% of the way through its cuts programme, so it's a pretty bad review at the fifth way through the programme, isn't it?
I mean, I reject the premise of the survey because the specific question is asked about do you support more spending, put in the context of do you support more spending on things like health and education rather than tax cuts. And the fact is clear that people generally put health and education as their highest priorities for public spending whenever they're asked about them. In fact, they're asked about them in this same survey and they come out at something like 30 and 40% as their main priorities. So it's a skewed question, it's a biased question, and generally if you put the question in a far more neutral context about whether people want to see higher spending or lower taxes, you will actually get about 3/4 of the people saying they want to see lower taxes as opposed to more spending as a priority.
I'm a bit lost on why you would reject the premise of the question. Surely a question which specifies what public spending is spent on is a more focused question and is liable to get a more responsible answer than one which is about generalities.
No, not at all, because if you ask the question in the context of spending which is unpopular, so for example, if you said, do you support more spending on things like international development, you will actually,
or nuclear weapons.
Yeah, you will find a completely different answer because you're putting a seed in someone's mind, asking the question as to as to how they want that spending to be spent. So I completely reject the premise of that question, and I would point you to other research that's been done over the years by a host of other polling companies, which suggests that actually, if you ask the straight question, should the government's priority be more spending or lower taxes, about 3/4 of the population will say lower taxes.
So what do you reckon to that argument, Tim, that if people were asked sort of in general and we took out the actual content of what government spends money on, we get a different result?
Well, you'll get a different result depending on who you ask anyway. For some people, they might actually want Trident and see that as a priority. For other people, they might like to see that cut and might like to see more money going in through to, say, families with disabled children who are facing a lot of cuts at the moment. What I think is quite interesting to look at is, over time, is there a shift in public opinion? Is there a move towards more people saying, yes, let's have some kind of government investment? And this seems to be what is happening now, that there does seem to be that movement from how people maybe felt a couple of years ago, where there was a bit more support for the government's austerity agenda. But now we see an economy that is going nowhere, that is going backwards again, and people, I think now they've been able to consider the arguments more and see what isn't working, realise that we do need a new approach and an investment for growth.
John, I mean, isn't this your case? Isn't it slightly counterintuitive when we've just seen a whole bunch of government ministers booed to the echo by tens of thousands of people inside the Olympic stadiums? They're surely expressing exactly the kind of attitudes which this survey shows.
Well, I don't know quite how you can make a kind of scientific judgment based on what you may have not heard in the Olympic Stadium.
The Olympic Stadium is probably a bigger cross-section of the population than the survey.
But then the biggest cheer went for Boris Johnson, who's a staunch supporter of the government's programme, so that you can kind of to take that either way. I think the fact is that people increasingly realise that the government has spent too much over the last decade or so, and that the idea that more public spending now is somehow going to get us back into growth territory is an absolute nonsense as far as I'm concerned, because we got into this mess, this economic mess of having a deficit we've never seen before and debt spiralling because the government was spending far too much money, not too little.
Really?
Well,
I thought we got into this mess because the government's deregulated the banks and the banks crashed the economy.
If you look at the figures, they bear that out. I mean, I'm sure that you will know that if you look at the situation for government debt and compare it with the situation for personal debt of individual households, and then of debt in the financial sector, that it's the household debt is much higher than the government debt. But the biggest one of all is the banking and financial sector debt, which now the government is saying it will kind of back up. And this is really very much a crisis that we've got that was created by the behaviour of certain types of companies out there in the private sector. But one of the advantages in a time like this is that we have now pretty much the lowest ever cost of borrowing for government. And when you get into one of these dangerous spirals of collapsing demand, you do need intervention to hold it up. And there are some quite positive things that the government can be doing to meet both its economic needs now and its social obligations.
But when an individual maxes out their own credit card, the answer is not to get another credit card and borrow even more. But yet you're suggesting that's the answer for what the government should be doing, because the government credit card is pretty much maxed out, but you want it to borrow more and spend more.
Well, we are not talking about an individual, and we are not talking about a credit card. Governments do not borrow money on a credit card. They borrow it on the sovereign bond market, which is very
but it's got to be paid back somehow, sometime.
And when you are, yes, it does. But when you look at historical levels of sovereign debt, we are actually at quite a manageable rate, and there is a bit of room.
The debt at the end of this government, despite the fact they're trying to reduce the deficit bit by bit, the national debt is going to be over £1 trillion.
Let's just step back, because I mean, we hear a lot of the maxed out credit card analogy from politicians and whatnot, but it's hogwash, isn't it? Because what's actually happened, if we want an analogy, is this. The banks crash the economy, they say to the government, bail us out, the government says we're lending you some money, and then as completely opposed to any individual transaction, instead of the government going to the people that it lent the money to and said, okay guys, we lent you some money, now why don't you give us the money back? Instead, the government's going to the rest of the population and say, we lent these guys some money, it's time for you to pay us back. Now, if that happened in individual life, there'd be uproar. You'd be arrested for doing that kind of thing.
Well, there are big questions over the way that the financial services companies and the banks and so on were regulated over the last period of time.
That was my point.
And that's a matter for politicians to look at what the mistakes that were made in terms of regulation of those and what lessons should be learnt from those.
But if we lent the banks the money, why aren't the banks repaying the government instead of the rest of the population?
Well, I mean, there's questions over, whether a bank should always necessarily be bailed out by the taxpayer if they behave irresponsibly. But
that's fine. Let them crash. But if we aren't going to let them crash, and we haven't, then why aren't they the people that are repaying instead of the rest of us? I mean, I didn't max out my credit card. My credit card's fine. I repay my pay every month. I pay the right money, and so do millions of people in this country. But the banks didn't.
Well, say that the banks have got to be regulated in a proper fashion, and quite how we get all the money circulating is a matter for the experts to sort out. But the idea that the government now should be borrowing more and more and spending more and more as a way of getting us back to growth, I just don't accept. In order to return to a position of economic growth, we need the public sector to be smaller, for the government to be spending less taxpayers' money, so that the productive sector of the economy, the businesses and so on, can unleash enterprise and grow.
Okay. Well, let me put that to Tim, because I mean that was exactly George Osborne's argument back in the beginning of the recession. We've had a few years of that happening, and now we're in a double dip recession. So, Tim, why do you think it hasn't worked, that policy?
Well, because we haven't seen the demand returning. I mean, we have started on these spending cuts, and the theory for those who advance that idea is that it then allows the private sector space to come in and invest. Now, we actually see a corporate sector that had started to build up big reserves of cash, and they are not reinvesting that here. So the problem that we have is that there is simply not the demand from ordinary people to go out and spend in shops and services, and the government is contracting that demand further. Now, the big danger perhaps is that the longer this goes on, those corporations are going to start looking to other countries and saying there is no value for us in reinvesting our money in the UK. Let's go and look at some of these emerging markets that are still more dynamic, and that really would be a disaster for our economy. I think what you have
and that's a reason, by the way, you're right, there's always going to be a danger that companies will look elsewhere, and that's a reason why we can't spend more in this country, because spending more will inevitably mean taxing more, and as soon as you tax more, you make the country less attractive to those companies who will look to go elsewhere.
Well, we have a very competitive business tax rate, so that's clearly not the problem. But I think it's just common sense that anybody can see right now that people simply do not have the same amount of money to spend as they did before the crunch, that the situation is getting worse and is being made worse by the government. When you make £20 billion of welfare cuts, like is happening, they are to households that economists call those with the highest marginal consumption rates. The most income-constrained households, if they have more cash in their pockets, can have the biggest multiplier effect in the economy. It's something that the International Monetary Fund has been recommending, and a study by the International Labour Studies Institute found that back in 2008, those countries that had, as a part of their fiscal stimulus plans at that time, a big emphasis on putting more cash to the most cash-constrained households, actually had the best recoveries from the previous recession.
So Jonathan, I mean, that's the Keynesian the argument for reflation. The American economy has had some of this. It may not be brilliant, but it's doing rather better than the British economy. Why not a plan B?
Well, there's all kinds of other things that the government ought to be doing. For instance, reducing massively the red tape and bureaucracy that businesses are constrained by in this country. Businesses, the bureaucracy they have to go to in order to employ someone is huge, and then if they wanted to get rid of someone, it's even more difficult. And there are certainly arguments for looking at that on the supply side to reduce those regulations, particularly for small businesses, which suffer in particular in these circumstances, in order to make that easier. I think in terms of the construction industry, which is often a sign of how well things are going, and getting things moving. We need to be deregulating the planning laws more quickly in order the construction sector to get building again. That'll be a really important part of kind of injecting some growth back into the economy.
Deregulating the banks got us into the mess, but further deregulation will get us out of the mess.
Well, this is deregulating situations for businesses, for individuals and small companies in particular, who are the engines of the economy in this country, who are the very people who are going to get us returning to growth and building things and making things again. It's absolutely
essential. What do you reckon to the deregulation argument?
I don't think it's a very evidence-based argument. I think if you look at the figures we've been seeing over the last few months for the monthly manufacturing surveys, what underlies the poor performance there doesn't seem to be that there is too much red tape in terms of employing people. It's simply that the order books are not filling up. The customers are not there.
So, I mean, with the housing market, you were mentioning the housing deregulation there. At the moment, 87% of the planning permissions go through the councils anyway. Presumably, even with deregulation, that won't increase that to 100%. So maybe you're talking about it going from 87% to 92%. That's not going to make a very big difference, is it?
Well, I talk to businessmen on a regular basis who tell me that the way the regulations and so on are structured, it makes their life far more difficult to get things moving, to employ people, to sell stuff, to set up new shops, set up new businesses, all the rest of it. And the more that government can do to make life easier for those people, the more likely we are to return to growth more quickly. So I think we should be looking at those things.
Tim, what do you make of some of the other findings in the report? For instance, the attitude towards immigration, which seems to be hardening under the impact of the recession.
Well, there is research to suggest that these kinds of public attitudes tend to move in a kind of reflecting sequence with the type of media that we have and media portrayals that we have. I'm not so much of an expert on the immigration issue, but certainly at Child Poverty Action Group, the public attitudes on benefit claimants is something that we know a lot about. And there was work commissioned by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation a couple of years back that did show there seemed to be this strong correlation between media portrayals and public perceptions about who benefit claimants are and why they are claiming benefit. So when you look at something quite worrying in this report today that suggests that quite a large amount of the population, a large minority, about a third, think that a majority of benefit claimants are on the fiddle, well, you can believe that if you think about the kind of stories that we see appearing in tabloid newspapers. But if you actually look at the facts, we have the lowest ever recorded levels of benefit fraud, and that was due to action by government over the last 10 years that was really very successful to put in a new framework to prevent and detect more fraud. And we actually saw over a 5-year period the fraud rate for benefits tumbling to a third of its previous level. It was a very big government success, but we never hear it spoken about. Perhaps if we did hear more of that kind of success championed in the media and a bit more reporting that reflected more the reality, then we would see a shift in the public attitudes to make it more aligned with what is the reality of the situation.
John, do you think that the sort of immigration argument has got out of hand now because it's pressurising politicians to do the kind of things that the border agency did to London Met with kind of disastrous, you do turf out 2,000 fee-paying foreign students, it creates a whole institution and possibly has a wider impact on the whole higher educational sector in this country that has a disastrous effect. Do you think that's something that could happen out of this kind of publicity?
I mean, the Taxpayers Alliance tends not to take any kind of formal view on immigration issues. Suffice to say that I think that the system needs to be policed properly and that the rules that are there should be adhered to. But at the same time, clearly anyone who wants to come to this country and contribute in a positive way to the British economy, probably ought to be welcomed with relatively open arms. Assuming that they're going to come here, do business, and create wealth, rather than in some way, use the British social security system to their own benefit. And in terms of welfare, I mean, Tim's talking about that. I think welfare is an issue where people genuinely see the need for the government to make some reforms, and the government does appear to be making some progress on implementing those because people do see, you talk about tabloid newspapers, but the stories that you see in tabloids expose some of the excesses of the system where you currently have, for example, families who are getting tens of thousands of pounds a year in housing benefit to live in houses that you or I couldn't afford for ourselves. And I think when you have a system where you have some people in receipt of benefits who are enjoying benefits that people paying into the system through tax are not getting for themselves, I think there's an injustice there that needs correcting.
So do you think that the stories in the tabloids, is your point that they're unrepresentative? Or do you think that some of them, I mean, we've just seen the Hillsborough thing, the tabloids just made that up. Do you think some of these are just made up?
Well, I think it's not so much made up. I think that what the approach tends to be is that it's actually very easy to find just the small number of cases that you need that are excessive and that you can understand why people would be upset to see that kind of case when they read about it. But the problem is that it gives the impression that this is very widespread, and it's actually not at all. We don't see the mainstream of what benefit claimants are like properly represented in the media because of that. I think at the same time, it's driven by a public feeling that we are spending too much altogether in terms of the total package in what we're spending on benefits. And there are certainly things that the government can do about that. But the idea that you can achieve that just by changing the rules of the system and not looking at what the drivers of it are, I think is unrealistic. We need to return to a proper policy of full employment, which we don't have at the moment. It makes no sense to be extremely punitive of people who can't find work when the jobs simply are not there. We also have a major problem, as we all know, with house prices and the supply of affordable housing. Now, benefit claimants don't want to be living in incredibly expensive housing. They don't keep that money themselves. It goes through to the landlords. So by putting in policies like the benefit cap to limit how much people can receive, you're not really solving the problem. And in fact, you're not tackling the broader problem.
It because the landlords will realise they can't get away with inflating their rents, which is basically what they've done, isn't it?
Well, what we are finding, the early findings from work that we're doing in London to find out how people are responding to this, is that partly they will have to move to places where it's much cheaper, but also the jobs are less likely to exist and they're more likely to be stuck long-term in dependency. But even more so than that, we're seeing a worrying trend that people will say, well, we don't want to take our children out of the school and move somewhere else. We don't want to move away from our families, so we'll just live in overcrowded accommodation.
But Tim, you and I have to make decisions about where we live based on the money we can afford and the family that we decide to have and how many children we have and so on and so forth. Why should people on benefits why should they be immune from having to make the same difficult choices that you and I might have to make?
I think maybe you're misunderstanding the system there, because housing benefit is actually an in-work benefit, which means that any accommodation that could be afforded by somebody out of work and on housing benefit could equally be afforded by somebody in work and on housing benefit, because of this, how the system works. In fact, the person in work would actually have a little bit more left over because of earnings disregards in the system. So the argument that some have made that those out of work are getting an unfair advantage in where they can live, it's actually completely wrong.
No, I haven't said there's an unfair advantage or anything, no. But I'm saying somebody in work and on housing benefit should still not be immune from having to move perhaps somewhere where property is a bit more cheap and more affordable.
Yeah, but hang on a minute. Housing prices have rocketed exponentially and far ahead of the rate of the increase in real wages. So somebody who 15 years ago was working just as hard as they're working today, were just as good a worker, can't afford to live where they could have afforded to live 15 years ago.
Nor can I.
No, but so what are we saying then? That the country isn't really run for ordinary working people and only some rich people are going to be able to choose where they live?
I don't think we should just throw up our hands and say we can do nothing about this. We do have choices. That's what politics is there for. If we want to say, we prefer it when London can be a place of mixed communities rather than a place where large swathes of it become no-go areas for your ordinary working people, and where perhaps people who, for generations, their families might have been located in the part of London and they can no longer afford it. Well, this is where politics becomes about the values and the kind of society we want to create, rather than just bowing down in front of the market.
I cannot afford to own a property where my parents live, despite the fact that I'm in full-time work. So
we're going to have to call time there because we've run out of time. I'm sure we'll be returning to these issues in future editions of the Politics and Media programme, and I hope that you'll be there to join us.